All right. Okay. So I've done an overview of the E4 project and the website and resources and so on. I did a quick overview of the Task 2 document we're going to be working on for the foreseeable future. I'm now going to give you some specific information on the first couple of slides. So looking at the interpretation of the brief, target audience slide, and then I think in the same segment you can tackle this character idea generation bit. But essentially I'll do a video for overview and audience, a video for creative elements, and a video for the visuals, etc. We'll break it up like that, rather than one big video for the whole thing that talks about each slide in detail. Okay. Right, so I will link these slides on the classroom, so you can come back and refer to them. I apologize, it is just going to be me talking at you for 10 minutes. I'm struggling to think of ways to make this kind of delivery more interactive and more interesting, so I am just going to be talking at you. So apologies up front for that. Right, so the interpretation of the brief. This is a kind of mixture of your analysis of the brief. This is proving that you've read it and that you understand some of the basic requirements, and a combination of that and your interpretation of various things. That's what's going into the interpretation of the brief. So you first of all have to read the brief and then summarize some of these questions here. So you need to explain what type of brief it is that you've been given, why the product is needed, what the medium is. So I'll give you a clue on that one, because that one seems to flummox people every now and again. The medium is 3D animation. We're not doing stop motion. We're not making anything in plasticine. Okay, it's digital 3D animation, CG, that kind of thing. That's the medium we're working in. Okay, we're not doing it via the medium of dance. This is 3D animation. Okay, what is the running time? What is the deadline? And what is the launch date? Now, these things are a little bit woolly because of our current situation with the college closure, etc. But there is some information on the unit guide. So these questions here you can answer just by reading the unit guide, just by reading the brief and the requirements. Okay, so I want you to answer them in sentences. Okay, in this slide, in your interpretation of the brief. Okay, I've given you some placeholder text to give you an idea of the quantity and the format. Okay, so this is not one-word answers. I've also copied and pasted these prompts into the slide notes here. So what type of brief it is, why is it needed, what's the medium, etc. These ones you can find clearly stated within the brief. Okay, you've just got to summarize what they are before moving on to the next part. The next part being some of the interpretation of the brief. First of all, I just wanted to clarify types of briefs. This is something we nearly got to in Unit 2. I don't think we covered it, but otherwise there are sort of 4 or 5 different types of brief. First of all, the client brief is just an instruction for a designer that outlines what the product is going to be and what various requirements there are. So it can be given to the media company in various different ways, and it can be formatted, or the situation can be one of several different types. So you need to have a think about what type of brief you've been given and just kind of explain that in that slide. Is it formal? Is it informal? Is there any negotiation with the client? Is there a contract? Has it been put out to tender? Is it a commission? So you can have a look from it. This has come from the Unit 2 textbook, from the pre-production and planning textbook. A formal brief being very well documented, discussed at scheduled meetings, various rules and regulations, specific requirements laid out in the documentation, whereas an informal one is usually discussed over the phone, or with a friend, for example. I'm working on a very informal brief for a friend at the moment, doing a logo design for his tech company. No documentation. We've not signed any contracts. Okay, we have a verbal agreement. We haven't even talked about deadlines or that kind of thing, right? It's very informal. When I get a chance, I can work on his logos. It can be negotiated, so the client and the producer work together to develop a brief for the project. Discussions take place where the various aims and objectives are kind of hashed out between the client and the designer. Contractual, pretty self-explanatory. There is a contract of employment involved. When something is put out to tender, a client puts an advert out or puts out a call for submissions, quite often done on forums like Polygon and various other forums online. And they will take bids from various different designers who can compete over the job. A commission is when a client hires a separate independent company to create the product. So they hire a specific company and they commission them to do the work for them. So there's various different types of briefs. You've just got to summarize which type of brief you have been given. Right, so when it comes to the areas that come down to your interpretation, I want you to talk about the implicit requirements, the open requirements, the explicit requirements of the brief, and the constraints on the project. And then how you're going to interpret some of these requirements. So first of all, implicit requirements are things that have been implied in the brief. They've not been clearly stated. So having a look through the brief, what is it that's implied? For example, I think it says something about E4 being quite quirky. Now that's quite vague. That is, what is that actually implying? What are we implying by it being quirky? Is there some kind of implication there, some kind of suggestion that's not clearly stated? Open requirements are where you've been given the freedom to make decisions about things. So have a think about the brief there and decide which parts are open. So there are more than one. I'll give you an example being the genre requirement. Okay, it doesn't specify that it needs to be within the sci-fi genre. Okay, this is open to your interpretation. You can choose. You have been given as a designer the freedom to make a decision on the genre. As long as it fits into one particular genre, it's up to you to decide what that is and how you're going to follow the conventions of that genre. Explicit requirements are those that are very clearly stated and must be met. So, for example, I'm pretty sure it says in the brief that it needs to be created with the use of 3D modeling and 3D animation. That's an explicit requirement of the brief that you cannot negotiate, you cannot interpret. It has to use 3D characters, environments, and props. In terms of constraints, these are the boundaries that you've got to work within. So these are going to be legal and ethical and time-based constraints. There's nothing in the brief actually about costing, although you do need to do a budget eventually. That's something that I should probably update in the brief. Note to self. So when I was getting these slides ready, I added a couple of things to the unit guide. So I realized there wasn't anything in the unit guide about the constraints. Okay, so I've just summarized the legal and ethical constraints here. So it mustn't breach copyright law or the laws on defamation. You must consider ethical issues such as selling, marketing to children or young people, and the use of violence or shocking imagery, and issues around diversity. You need to be aware of the regulatory bodies, so you need to understand who the Advertising Standards Authority are, what the CAP codes are, what the rules that you must kind of follow, and also the regulations of the Office of Communications, Ofcom, who regulate television and radio in the UK. Okay, so you don't need to go into too much detail on this just now. You will have a slide later on where you need to specifically discuss these things and how you're going to deal with these laws and showing that you understand what the copyright law is in the UK, etc. For the time being, you just need to summarize this and be aware that there are these constraints on you. So that's the interpretation of the brief. And these things I've said are in the slide notes. Actually, there's a couple of other things here. How are you going to interpret that element of core British or core human values? It's not necessarily mandatory, but I would like you to make a token effort of acknowledging that in your interpretation. This is now where you have to make a decision, though, about genre. So what genre are you going to work within? Remember, it's all very organic, so you're not necessarily signing a contract here that you are going to stick with a romantic comedy or a zombie film, horror genre, okay? It can change, so don't worry about committing to anything at the moment, but we do need to start making decisions about the direction of your animation. So you should really have a clear idea by now, what genre you're going to work within. Okay, so you need to be able to discuss your interpretation of that open requirement, asking you to pick a genre, and then how that's going to be integrated in your designs, the designs of your character. So if it's a horror genre, how's that affecting your character? What type of character are you going to have, and how's that character going to follow standard genre conventions? What type of character from the horror genre is it? Is it the outdated damsel in distress, or is it a zombie, or that kind of thing? And then the same thing with the environment. Are you sticking with these kind of standard haunted house tropes, or are you going to do a kind of paranormal activity take on the horror genre and have it set in a modern bedroom? Okay, so that's the interpretation of the brief slide. The next slide you're going to be doing is the target audience one. And so I need to remind you of something you learned as part of Unit 1, which was what an imaginary entity is. So this is that idea of companies coming up with an ideal member of their audience and condensing all their ideas about audience into one person. It makes it a bit easier to work out who this product is aimed at if you try and condense all these ideas into one person. Okay, so we sort of talked about why companies need that ideal audience member, and how that is of benefit. So just as a quick reminder, it's really important to understand who's consuming your product. Without that knowledge, it's going to be very difficult to operate successfully. You need to know who your potential audience is so that you can find out if they're going to be interested in it. So you can get feedback throughout the development process about whether you're on the right lines. So luckily, your target audience, if you were to sum it up, is yourselves. It's kind of your age group, young people. So we could do some polling between each other. We certainly will start doing that in terms of getting feedback on your designs and your early drafts of your animation. So you need to know who your audience is so you can sell that information to potential advertisers. If you want to get external advertisers involved, you need to be able to say, well, you've got this huge demographic who are going to be interested in your product, and therefore, your advertising is going to reach these people. You need to know if they're going to be interested in it. Is there a gap in the market that you can exploit? Okay, so that was the imaginary entity and the reasons why it's useful to come up with one. And then when it comes to actually discussing that imaginary entity, I want you to do this through demographics and psychographics. So demographics being these kind of quantifiable elements of your target audience. So their age, their gender, what jobs they do, where they live, so geographical location, their marital status, that kind of thing. These are facts. And then psychographics is lifestyle choices, what sort of personality, beliefs, values, what sort of things do they do, what other media products are they consuming. You've got to think about who this person is. Do they like to go to the library and read fantasy novels on a Saturday afternoon, or do they go to the cinema on a Friday night and watch Marvel films? Nobody's doing any of that stuff at the moment, but you get the idea. So brief reminder of target audience demographics. First of all, think of the social grade. So I'm pretty sure you did this with Laura and Emma. This is a way of grouping people based on occupation and income. Okay, so the A, B, C1 grade relating to a social class and a sort of summary of what sort of jobs they do. Okay, so it can be you're targeting one of those groups or several. So it's usually the sort of A, B, C1. These are the people that have got expendable money to spend on things like DVDs and games and things. But this is a television channel. Does that affect the social grade that you're targeting? Okay, is it wider or narrower? So yes, when it comes to psychographics, so with the demographics, I want you to be specific about the age and the gender, the job, or has he got a job, or has she got a job, is she at college, these kind of things. Think about social grade. When it comes to psychographics, psychographics, just to remind you, is more about lifestyle choices. Okay, so it's important to remember that we don't just group people by their age and their gender and their postcode, where they live. Okay, we need to think about these people in terms of what sort of beliefs they have, what their attitudes are, what lifestyle choices they have, and what their other interests are, to get a really rounded view of this person or this audience. Okay, and there are lots of different organizations that have come up with different frameworks to group people in this way. Just got two examples to remind you of. Young and Rubicon was an advertising agency that came up with this stuff. So categorizing people by lifestyle choice, so falling into categories such as mainstream, people who aspire and seek status, people who are really keen to succeed and are very controlling and have strong goals and confidence and motivation, people who are resigned and seek survival, who choose brands that stress safety and familiarity, typically older people. There are explorers who are into discovering things and taking chances. They're first to try new brands. So this is you guys. Brand choices highlight their personality, that kind of thing. We've got strugglers who are looking to escape, who feel alienated and disorganized. Reformers who are looking for enlightenment and freedom of restrictions. Anti-materialistic. All right, so these are groups that have just been come up by this advertising agency. We also have the VALS framework, which is very similar. Innovators, thinkers, achievers, experiencers, believers, strivers, makers, and survivors. Okay, so I want you to think about these things and really kind of get into the mind of your target audience, because you've got to fill a whole slide describing this person or persons. So to summarize that, write in detail about who this imaginary entity is. What is the demographic? What are the lifestyle choices? And then I want you to relate that to the work that you have to do. So the character designs that you have to come up with, the environment designs, the storyline. How's that going to appeal to that audience, this storyline? Okay, is it controversial? Is it shocking? Is it funny? Is it scary? Does it relate to risk or exploring, or diversity, or the seeking of satisfaction, or being the first to try something out, that kind of thing? Doesn't have to, but maybe it will. It'll help you write this slide if it does. And remember, again, this is not necessarily setting these things in stone. Okay, so remember, it's online. It will be going on TV, but essentially in one of the three specs, I think it's the AV promo spec, it does say that it needs to be something that's going to be delivered online. So yes, think about that and think about how you're going to appeal to that audience. A lot of that is going to be down to your use of genre conventions also. So don't forget to waffle on there about how you are using blue lighting and futuristic environment elements to appeal to that sort of sci-fi element within your demographic. Whatever your genre choice is, discuss the conventions. It's another good time, another good excuse to start really thinking about what these things are that you're going to include in your animation. And then this is part of the next section, part of the creative elements, but I think it can probably be done in the same lesson. The character idea generation part is the next slide in task 2. So all I want you to do there is link to the document you have already completed. Okay, you've already done the character idea generation. That was when I gave you out those stupid bits of card with the drawings on them, and we were not brainstorming, thought showering, various different personalities for different types of characters. So that's a little reminder of what that document looks like. You have to list appearance and behavior and emotional state and how the characters talk and so on. Can you just right click and get the shared link from your Google Drive and paste that in there so that we've got that all in the same area? Okay, so I'll make another video for your next lesson covering the next stage, the creative elements. I hope that helps. Please ask if you've got any questions, etc.